Deboss Garage is hosting an online car show, and I figured I'd throw my hat in the ring. Now you might be thinking, hold on, what car are you going to submit? I don't really have a car, I just have a collection of vaguely assorted parts that kind of looks like a car. But hear me out. They added a Gearheads Choice category, which will focus on YouTubers / builders. So since I have about 25 videos on this build so far, I figure might as well throw my hat in the ring. I'm also going to submit this to the Ingenuity category because 1, I'm hoping Skid Factory will get a kick out of this build, and 2, the category states unique builds with limited resources, and I think this definitely hits both those categories. So let me walk you through the build thus far. The build is based on a 1994 Ford Explorer, and the end goal is to put this 12-valve P-pump Cummins in this little Explorer. It's a pretty audacious plan, but I think we're getting there. So my crazy idea was that I wanted a 12-valve Cummins in an Explorer. I had a Ford Explorer as my high school off-roader, and I really loved this vehicle. I really loved the chassis, and I just wanted to do a build that was a bit silly, a bit ridiculous, and would just be a riot to drive. Now, I considered lots of other options, including a 4BT and whatnot, but in the end I decided 4BT costs twice as much for half the power. If I'm gonna do it, I might as well just go big and go with a 12-valve. Obviously, this is a pretty silly build, and I know that. It's not exactly meant to be practical or sensical or anything like that. I just think it'll be fun. And that's sufficient reason. So once I figured out what I wanted to do, first things first, I needed a vehicle. The local high school auto shop had this white Explorer, and the auto program was being shut down. He actually ended up selling this to me for just $100, and it ended up being a parts car for my high school Explorer for a long time. But this Explorer is much cleaner and much nicer than my high school Explorer ever was. So it ended up being the basis for this build. Once I had an Explorer, I had to get the drivetrain for it. So I managed to find a Ram 2500 parts truck on Craigslist, and in true Deboss fashion, ripping the 12-valve out of that, and the rest of the truck, once I get everything I need out of it, is going to be scrapped. Now, the only issue with that parts truck is that it was a 2-wheel drive truck. Honestly, if it was a 4-wheel drive truck, I probably would have decided just to use the Ram's chassis with the Explorer's cab, but since it was a 2-wheel drive truck, I ended up going with the Explorer's chassis. So the Explorer's chassis was going to need a lot of modification, so first thing was first, I needed to find out a way to get this body off that chassis in my little 2-car garage. I ended up rigging up a cherry picker to make it work. So that body's been on and off a couple times for fitment now, and next things next, I needed to start working on the chassis. First thing I wanted was to make sure that I had axles under this chassis that were going to hold up to the big diesel engine. So I took the Dana 70 out of the Ram parts truck, and that's what's going in the rear. It's a full float Dana 70, pretty nice axle. And then for the front axle, since that was a 2-wheel drive truck, I had to get something else. I ended up getting a Dana 50 TTB out of a junkyard. Most people hate TTB, but I'm actually a fan of them. So this is kind of a weird axle, but $200 at a junkyard, and this came behind power strokes and everything else, so it should handle up great to the Cummins. I ended up having to fabricate custom mounts and do a lot of modification to get this to work. And then while I was at it, I also added mounts for some custom radius arms. Once I had 3/4 ton axles in the front and rear, I wanted to get the drivetrain to fit. So I cut the stock motor mounts out of the chassis of the Ram, and I modified them and welded them here to the Explorer chassis. For now, this is how they sit, but they still need some boxing, as does the cross member here, needs some boxing, but then the engine fit. After that, I needed to get the transmission to fit, so I made a custom transmission cross member for that. Now the transmission I ended up going with, the Ram came with a 47RH transmission, which is an automatic. I really wanted a manual transmission. In my opinion, I just think they're more fun, even if they might not necessarily be as good off-road. So I went with a manual transmission. This is an NV4500 out of a Chevy pickup. I got a advanced adapters bell housing for it, as well as a new clutch, flywheel, all that stuff. This ended up needing a new input shaft in order to bolt to the Cummins, so I went ahead and did that. And then I grabbed this NP241 DHD out of a Ram 1500 from Craigslist again. And this also needed a new input shaft in order to bolt up to the NV4500, so that got a new input shaft as well. And at that point, the whole drivetrain bolts together, and it also bolts into the chassis. Once the drivetrain bolted into the chassis, the next thing that I wanted to do was make sure that this frame was going to stand up to it. This isn't strictly necessary, but I'm hoping it will help this frame a little bit off-road. So what I'm going to be doing is boxing this frame. I ran some finite element analysis on this frame, and it turns out that I can actually make this Explorer frame as rigid in torsion as the Ram frame just by boxing the thing. So that was good news. I went ahead and I prepped the frame by wire wheel and removing all the rust from it. And I painted the inside of the frame with some stainless steel spray paint, which I'm hoping will hold up to me welding. But once I weld the plates on for the boxing, then I'll know whether I need to do something else to coat the inside of the frame to prevent corrosion. But for now, I'm hoping the stainless paint on the inside will prevent any corrosion on the inside, even after welding. That's the history of this project. What I still need to do is install shocks front and rear. It needs steering, brakes and fuel lines, the clutch ramp, gauges, and at that point, it's gonna be running and driving. And that's my goal right now, is I want this thing to be running and driving. I have lots of mods planned for it once it is running and driving, but for now, that's the first goal. So that's my submission to the Deboss Garage Car Show. I'd like to thank Deboss Garage for hosting this and specifically for opening up a category to YouTubers and builders. And I'd like to thank the judges for their consideration. If you're watching this video on my channel, then I highly recommend that you check out the car show. I'll put a link in the description. I'll try and add some dates to let you know when it's happening. If you are watching this on my channel, I'd really appreciate you going and voting for my build in the Ingenuity and Gearhead categories, if you think I deserve it. I believe you get 20 odd votes or something, so go ahead and vote for all your favorite cars in the car show. If you're watching this submission elsewhere, then thanks for considering my submission. I've been putting over 40 hours a week into this for quite a few months now, so I'm hoping that this project will continue at a decent pace, and hopefully in the near future we can see this thing actually running and driving. That's the goal anyways. As usual, thanks for hanging out with me in my garage today, and I hope to see you next time.